Hey, yo, welcome to the podcast. It's been a while, hasn't it? I've been busy with family visiting and stuff, but we're back. So, this is the episode on based Kafka. I had an interesting discussion with some buddies the other day about what based means, and my favorite was actually honest. Isn't that a nice definition of based? But anyway, a little bit of advertising here first. In a week or so, maybe less, one of my new, really my only favorite current podcasts called The Art of Darkness, or I believe just Art of Darkness, hosted by Kevin Kautzman and Brad Kelly, whom you should follow on Twitter, available on Spotify. These guys are going to do an episode on Franz Kafka next, and so I just finished listening to their latest episode on Stanley Kubrick. It was really good. And I was inspired to sort of jump on the gun here and sort of get ahead of them, basically as a way to, sort of steer some viewers over that way, because they seem to be doing good work and working hard at it. So anyway, in this episode, I'm going to talk about Kafka's The Metamorphosis, but this is really, honestly, probably only sort of an oral hors d'oeuvre and something to encourage people to try the Art of Darkness podcast. I taught college students for 13 years, and I believe Kafka's Metamorphosis was the only story that I taught every single semester. After about 10 years of teaching it, which for me meant talking to 20-year-olds about it, that's sort of how I would teach, and it was the one story, by the way, that they seemed to enjoy, I reached a few tentative conclusions about what makes the story so good. So I'm going to tell you that stuff, and then I might sprinkle in something about why I think the story is technically based. And if you don't know what based means, honestly, just Google it at this point. Kafka's biography is very interesting. Actually, it's interesting how interesting it is. If you read his biography on Wikipedia, it's about twice as long as most biographies of comparable authors, and longer than you would expect, and full of interesting details about his family dynamic, even from the time of his Jewish ritual sacrificer grandfather. He was born in 1883 and encouraged to speak German by his family, which means that his family encouraged him to succeed in, a German, perhaps more than a Jewish way. He died in 1923 at age 40, early Weimar period, of tuberculosis. The Metamorphosis was first published in 1915 during World War I when he was about 32 years old. A friend, Max Brod, said Kafka was tortured by sexual desire, constantly womanizing and almost always failing. He visited brothels and showed an interest in pornography, according to Wikipedia, which maybe wasn't so rare in the Weimar period. But anyway, I think that's Hawes as the source on that, if you're looking. I was reading some of this on Wikipedia, but reading the sources too. That was a 2008 book, so interesting. Kafka, as I said, was Jewish and an atheist, but also deeply interested in Jewishness and spirituality. He's often said to have been sympathetic to Zionism, but his work hardly reflects that. I would say there's a heavy trace of Jewishness in his writing, but only indirectly, and by way of allusion or tone even. What you do see is themes of alienation and disorientation that sort of pervade his work, but I don't think it's necessarily true or fair to say that those are themes exclusively owned by Jewishness. So anyway, this story and I think almost everyone knows how it begins, and probably half of people have read it. It's very widely assigned. It's a very popular story. I assume most of my listeners have at least looked at it. And it begins like this, at least in one translation. One morning, when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. Often translated as beetle or even cockroach, most critics have followed Nabokov's lead and focused on the literalness of Gregor's bodily transformation. He becomes a beetle, about 3 feet long, and he's beset by some exceedingly mundane, that is, literal, attendant challenges. For example, opening his bedroom door with his new set of mandibles, or later trying to dislodge an apple that his father threw at him from the shell on his back. The effect of this literalness is that we're challenged by the author to sort of overcome the relatively obvious analogy. So while many authors might make a thing out of a character where like the character becomes a bug or feels bug-like or something like that, to make the point about the like bare life conditions that capitalism seems to produce, in Kafka, eventually the hugely imaginative metaphor becomes sort of secondary to the very real social and psychological insights. So where like somebody like, I don't know, Gogol or whatever might have written a story about a guy turning into a bug, but if he had, or if anyone had before Kafka, the story would have been like, the emphasis would have been all on the character's awareness of his transformation, and like the transformed character certainly would have worried most about, turning himself back into a human. But something really different happens in Kafka, starting in about paragraph 3. So let's take a look at that turn. I want you to listen with me to the beginning. These are the first 3 or 4 paragraphs of the story. Again, one morning when Gregor Samsa woke from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armor-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. The bedding was hardly able to cover it and seemed ready to slide off at any moment. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, waved about helplessly as he looked. "What's happening to me?" he thought. It wasn't a dream. His room, a proper human room, although a little too small, lay peacefully between its 4 familiar walls. A collection of textile samples lay spread out on the table. Samsa was a traveling salesman, and above it there hung a picture that he had recently cut out of an illustrated magazine and housed in a nice gilded frame. It showed a lady fitted out with a fur hat and fur boa who sat upright, raising a heavy fur muff that covered the whole of her lower arm towards the viewer. Gregor then turned to look out the window at the dull weather. Drops of rain could be heard hitting the pane, which made him feel quite sad. How about if I sleep a little bit longer and forget all this nonsense, he thought. But that was something he was unable to do, because he was used to sleeping on his right, and in his present state he couldn't get back into that position. However hard he threw himself onto his right, he always rolled back to where he was. He must have tried it 100 times, shut his eyes so that he wouldn't have to look at the floundering legs, and only stopped when he began to feel a mild, dull pain that he had never felt before. Now, it's very engaging, isn't it? Like, most people just can't wait to keep reading. Like, it's such a perfect few paragraphs here. The first thing I'll note is that line where it's the beginning of paragraph 2, where we get his internal monologue. It says, "What happened to me, he thought." So, like, we are able to see inside his mind, right? And then it says, the very next sentence, "It wasn't a dream." Now, that's not his voice, that's the voice of the narrator, and, like, you have to trust the narrator. That's the only source of information you have here. So, you kind of like, at the beginning of the second paragraph, you're told by the narrator, no, this isn't a dream. This guy literally turned into a bug. And it's kind of like, how am I supposed to read this? Like, this is sort of a challenge to the reader here. But if you've listened carefully, or read this carefully, you'll no doubt understand my pausing here to ask the obvious question, which is like, well, what happens next, right? My God, a man turned into a bug. Like, imagine it. Imagine yourself waking up as a bug with 6 legs in the air and mandibles. Like, and you're not dreaming. This shit is really happening, Like, is there any possible correct reaction other than like, ah, you know what I mean? And what are you supposed to do after that? You just go on screaming until you're not a bug anymore, until the nightmare ends, right? But no, that's not where Kafka goes with this story. Here are the next 2 paragraphs, which again, we might expect to just be Gregor screaming for help in a horror at his physical transformation. But instead, this is what we get. Quote, "Oh God," he thought, "what a strenuous career it is that I've chosen. Traveling, day in and day out, doing business like this takes much more effort than doing your own business at home. And on top of that, there's the curse of traveling, worries about making train connections, bad and irregular food, contact with different people all the time, so that you can never get to know anyone or become friendly with them. It can all go to hell." He felt a slight itch up on his belly, pushed himself slowly up on his back toward the headboard so that he could lift his head better, found where the itch was, and saw that it was covered with lots of little white spots which he didn't know what to make of. And when he tried to feel the place with one of his legs, he drew it quickly back, because as soon as he touched it, he was overcome by a cold shudder. He slid back into his former position. "Getting up early all the time," he thought, "it makes you stupid. You've got to get enough sleep. Other traveling salesmen live a life of luxury. For instance, whenever I go back to the guest house during the morning to copy out the contract, these gentlemen are always still sitting there eating their breakfasts. I ought to just try that with my boss. I'd get kicked out on the spot, but who knows? Maybe that would be the best thing for me. If I didn't have my parents to think about, I'd have given in my notice a long time ago. I'd have gone up to the boss and told him just what I think. Tell him everything, I would. Let him know just what I feel. He'd fall right off his desk. And it's a funny sort of business to be sitting up there at your desk, talking down at your subordinates from up there, especially when you have to go right up close because the boss is hard of hearing. Well, there's still some hope. Once I've got the money together to pay off my parents' debt to him, another 5 or 6 years, I suppose, that's definitely what I'll do. That's when I'll make a big change. First of all, though, I've got to get up. My train leaves at 5. And that's the end of the quote there. So again, this guy wakes up. He's a literal cockroach bug with bug legs and bug body and bug face. But somehow still he's thinking about employment, about not disappointing his boss, about supporting his family, and about, alienation, basically. So what the hell is this? Why is this what it says? You know what I mean? Why does he seem to simply accept the absolute strangeness of his new form? And why does he start kvetching about work? What the hell does this whole page about work and missing work and the morning routine and his boss all have to do with the obviously more pressing matter of his being a bug? Of course, the answer is these are entirely related. In fact, Kafka doesn't just give us one little blip about Gregor worrying about work. He puts it right there, right after the announcement of bugness, and he keeps his camera focused on the work question for the next 2 or 3 pages. This story is about work, okay? Now, you might believe me and still not put the pieces together. You might go, okay, it's about work, but then why does he turn into a bug? And it's a good question. Why not just write a story like Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, which was certainly about the alienation brought about by middle-class bureaucratic jobs. But okay, most of you have got it by now, I imagine. This is the Bug Man, right? The original Bug Man. You should Google Bug Man, too, if you haven't heard that phrase. But what exactly makes a Bug Man buggy? Is he born that way? The answer is no. In fact, very exactly, he is not born buggy. He is metamorphosed into a bug man. He is a former human being, but he's no longer a human being. And I just want you to chew on this with me. What does it all mean? What does work have to do with becoming a bug? Gregor rolls around, lamenting his fate, struggling to throw off the covers, wondering what time it is and when people will notice his absence. And Kafka gives us his inner monologue. Quote, "The time was now 7:10, and he would have to make a final decision very soon. Then there was a ring at the door of the flat. That'll be someone from work, he said to himself, and froze very still, although his little legs only became all the more lively as they danced around. For a moment, everything remained quiet. "They're not opening the door," Gregor said to himself, caught in some nonsensical hope. But then, of course, the maid's firm steps went to the door as ever and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first words of greeting, and he knew who it was. The Chief Clerk himself. Why did Gregor have to be the only one condemned to work for a company where they immediately became highly suspicious at the slightest shortcoming? Were all employees, every one of them, louts? Was there not one of them who was faithful and devoted and who would go so mad with pangs of conscience that he couldn't get out of bed if he didn't spend at least a couple hours in the morning on company business? Was it really not enough to let one of the trainees make inquiries, assuming inquiries were even necessary? Did the chief clerk have to come himself? And did they have to show the whole innocent family that this was so suspicious that only the chief clerk could be trusted to have the wisdom to investigate it? And more because these thoughts had made him upset than through any proper decision, he swung himself with all his force out of his bed. End quote there. Yes, why did Gregor have to be the only one condemned to work for a company that immediately becomes suspicious at the slightest shortcoming, whereas all the rest of us work for very flexible bosses who don't mind if we take a morning off to sleep in because it's cold and rainy in, a German winter morning? But of course it's not that way, right? And that's when the story really starts to click and really gets dangerous or provocative. You begin to realize that it's not how Gregor's story is so extraordinary. Instead, the point is how ordinary Gregor is. Yes, he has, mandibles instead of a human jaw, and 6 limbs instead of 4, and so on. But in the essential points, he is just like all of us. Watch this little video, if I can get it in here, to sort of hold off the panic attack that should be coming on now as you realize what's happening here.
Before the law, there stands a God. A man comes from the country, begging admittance to the law. But the God cannot admit him. Can he hope to enter at a later time? That is possible, says the God. The man tries to peer through the entrance. He had been taught that the law should be accessible to every man. Do not attempt to enter without my permission, says the God. I am very powerful, yet I am the least of all the gods. From hall to hall, door after door, each God is more powerful than the last. By the God's permission, the man sits down by the side of the door, and there he waits. For years, he waits. Everything he has, he gives away, in the hope of bribing the God, who never fails to say to him, I take what you give me, only so that you will not feel that you have left something undone. Keeping his watch during the long years, the man has learned to know even the fleas in the God's fur collar. And growing childish in old age, he begs the very fleas to persuade the God to change his mind and allow him to enter. His sight is dimmed, but in the darkness he perceives a radiance streaming immortally from the door of the law. And now, before he dies, all his experience condenses into one question, a question he has never asked. He beckons to the God. Says the God, you are insatiable. What is it now? Says the man, every man strives to attain the law. How is it then that in all these years, no one else has ever come here seeking admittance? His hearing has failed, so the God yells into his ear, no one else but you could ever have obtained admittance. No one else could enter this door. This door was intended only for you. And now, I'm going to close it. This tale is told during the story called The Trial. It has been said that the logic of this story is the logic of a dream.
So, the circumstances of the story, of the metamorphosis, are all very important as you begin to construct your interpretation. And the story does beg for explanation. I used to encourage students to keep close watch on how the other characters in the story, so Gregor's boss, his mom and dad, his sister, the maid, as well as a couple neighbors, how all of these people react to his becoming a bug. Again, it's not exactly realistic. I mean, if anyone actually became a bug, we would all sort of just like scream and try to wake ourselves up and call for help and so on. That's not how they react. So we're in like a different universe here. When the mother first sees him, for example, she falls into her skirt and sort of covers her face and sobs. And okay, like maybe that's how a mother would react. But the father, for example, he sort of shakes his fist, I think it says pugnaciously, at Gregor in anger, which seems pretty suggestive here. Like, I wouldn't get angry at my children if they turned into bugs. You know what I mean? Literally. Because you'd be like, this is crazy, help us, like that. But to get mad suggests a different layer is happening here. So that's helpful, maybe. The boss is even more measured. Here's his speech. Or I guess it's the chief clerk or whatever. "Mr. Samsa," he called to him, "what is wrong? You barricade yourself in your room, give us no more than yes or no for an answer. You're causing serious and unnecessary concern to your parents, and you fail, and I mentioned this just by the way, you fail to carry out your business duties in a way that is quite unheard of. I'm speaking here on behalf of your parents and of your employer, and really must request a clear and immediate explanation. I am astonished, quite astonished. I thought I knew you as a calm and sensible person, and now you suddenly seem to be showing off with peculiar whims. This morning your employer did suggest a possible reason for your failure to appear, it's true. It had to do with the money that was recently entrusted to you. But I came near to giving him my word of honor that that could not be the right explanation. But now that I see your incomprehensible stubbornness, I no longer feel any wish whatsoever to intercede on your behalf. And nor is your position all that secure. I had originally intended to say all this to you in private. But since you caused me to waste my time here for no good reason, I don't see why your parents should not also learn of it. Your turnover has been especially unsatisfactory of late. I grant you that it's not the time of year to do especially good business. We recognize that. But there is simply no time of year to do no business at all, Mr. Samsa. We cannot allow there to be." I mean, the boss guy here really underlines the theme of, the, what's the word here? Like, the necessity of work, but, taken to the nth degree. There's never a day that we can take off from making profits, right? But he doesn't seem, you maybe notice, very emotionally ruined by Gregor's being a bug. Gregor's younger sister actually tries to take care of Gregor when she first finds out that he's a bug, and she seems to mediate between him and his parents. But eventually, when Gregor embarrasses her by crawling out in front of the neighbors during her violin recital, she does snap and starts calling Gregor it instead of Gregor, sort of finally. And the maid hardly seems bothered at all by Gregor's change of form. So you see these varying reactions in terms of like the emotional valence or whatever, or intensity for these different characters in the story. So what kind of behavior would, for example, and I think of Gregor as being in his mid-20s or something. So if you're too old for that, maybe you have to just imagine yourself being 25. But what kind of behavior would you have had to do in order to elicit just these sorts of reactions, to make mom almost faint, to make dad pissed off at you, disappointed, Sister tries to intervene on your behalf at first, but eventually gives up. The boss gives a shot at convincing you to reform, but, what's it to him if your whole entire family relies on you for your salary? I mean, he doesn't care. Eventually you're fired, right? And the chief clerk guy just extracts himself from the mess. So I used to have students say, well, maybe a drunk addiction or something. And yeah, maybe. Okay, a total derail, like a drug addiction or something. Or a failure to launch situation. Yes, maybe. A guy who, or I can picture, because, the details of the story, Gregor seems to become kind of dirty and he stops taking care of himself. So you could see a guy who kind of gets a job, but he hates the job. He doesn't love living with his family. He just has this one room. It's always winter in Berlin, and he stops shaving, and his hair gets too long, and his necktie is ugly, and kind of like that. Maybe that interpretation works. Or how about holding extremely alienating political views? I mean, it's possible. The story doesn't really suggest that, but it might work in a similar way. A decade ago, I always had one student say, coming out as gay might make my family react like that. And okay, maybe. But I don't think And by the way, they didn't say that as much in the past few years, which is interesting because I guess like basically parents are cool with it now. You know, they don't like dad doesn't get mad anymore. He goes like, we support you, son. You know, like and so like it doesn't work if that was like a potential interpretation. So whatever, whether this story and its like Weltanschauung are based or not, I guess I'll let you guys decide. But I anticipate the central tug of war might be over whether, like, acknowledging that circumstances make or ruin the man, whether that is a helpful and important or a whiny and conspiratorial way of doing analysis, right? So, like, for this reason, the Metamorphosis seems to be a literary descendant of Melville's Bartleby, and and probably Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground too. And both stories, I think, succeed in inflicting a very bizarre, like unsettling sort of psychological uneasiness upon the readers. One thing I think is pretty clear, and that is that the nature of work has changed so significantly in the last 200 years. First in the 19th century, as first world nation states industrialized, and you know people took jobs at like factories or in like assembly lines and not farming. And then secondly, in the move to the modern period where people are no longer even in assembly lines or working with their hands, but now it's like they're in cubicles and maybe we're entering a third phase where you just work on a computer from home, right? So like calling it all work, it sort of belies the reality that it's become a hugely different thing in the 200 or 300 years that sort of things have been moving this quickly. So, for example, while Kafka's grandfather was a ritual kosher slaughterer, living a life that seems almost timeless and traditional, his father was a traveling salesman, and then a fashion retailer. And then what was left for the son but to like sell insurance from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., which Kafka himself did, and his journal from the period indicates that he was very unhappy with his schedule. So anyway, I guess the point is this story simply could not have been written in 1750. Because the kind of life lived by a traveling salesman in Berlin or Vienna or Prague in the early 20th century wasn't livable in 1750. You just didn't have people doing that job. And I guess I think if you say, for example, that like, well, if you say that examining such a change in civilization and its effects on human psychology and flourishing and thriving and stuff, and if you say that like, or if you conclude from that with Kafka that maybe this wasn't the best change, that maybe it's not working out, that maybe the cubicles are not like encouraging people's best lives. Do you see what I'm saying? If you conclude that with Kafka, like, I mean, I don't know. If you say that, like, looking at the hypermodern situation, okay, and trying to point out that some of its shortcomings are significant, like I think that's a reasonable thing to do, but others will say, no, it's whiny, or it's, you know, Marxist claptrap, or whatever, or it's utopian, like as if, like, well, how should people make a living? You know, they always kind of throw it back in your lap, as if, like, okay, well, I mean, I'm just pointing out that work is pretty alienating and it doesn't really contribute to meaning in the human experience and so on. And you go like, you know, like, and your response to that is like, capitalism is the best possible way to organize the world and we can't talk about criticizing it. I mean, I guess whatever, fine, but to me, I disagree. And I suspect maybe you've been a bug for so long that you don't even remember what it was like to be a human anymore. And that's like sad. You know, these are the worst sorts of bugs, actually. They don't love music or leisure. They seem to love nothing more than shaming people who don't throw themselves into work. It's quite sad, actually, the whole thing, the whole dynamic, and our futile discourse about the thing. Quite pathetic, you know? Okay, one other thing. If I have time here, I'm going to shove a clip in that I saw of Kenneth Brown setting up a longer video, and I'll link to the video if I do this right, where he like dreamed up this scenario of a drunken police officer pulling over a sober person, and the sober person basically tries to do a citizen's arrest on him. And it was a really interesting video because I don't think it works. Like I think it's what I would call like bad sci-fi or something. But it was interesting because it was that. I don't mean to take anything away from what Kenneth was doing, but it's like what I like there. In fact, I think my next video I'm going to talk about the American romance as a form of literature. So I'm going to talk about especially Hawthorne. One of the things Hawthorne said is that like when you write a good story or a fiction, it has to stay true to the human heart. So like you might throw in dragons or, you know, ghosts or things that kind of don't exist. But the rule is that you have to be serious about how a human would really react under those circumstances. And I think that that's what Kafka gets right. Like what he gets right is that although people don't turn into bugs, and if they did, they would just scream and yell about waking up. But the point is that once you realize turning into a bug has something to do with work culture and professionalization and modernity and all that stuff, and then you can kind of do that active interpretation, now you're in the right universe, and then like within that, human nature has to stay true to the human heart. Okay? And I think like that was what was like felt incorrect about Kenneth's video here. So watch his video first. Boom.
So, imagine you're on the road and a police officer pulls you over and he says, "How much have you been taking tonight?" And you say, "Officer, have you been drinking tonight?" And he says, "I've only had one beer." And you say, "Officer, I'm going to need you to back away from the vehicle. And I'm going to need you to take a breathalyzer test." And the officer says, "Aw, man, is that all? You're going to make me do that? Anything else you want me to do for you?" And you say, "Yes, officer. I need you to hug me and tell me everything's going to be okay. I need you to hug me. And I need you to tell me that everything's going to be okay because I've had an emotion."
And I don't know, do you see what I mean there? Like, it's kind of like I just resist it from the very start. I just go, well, this couldn't happen. This wouldn't actually happen. It wouldn't happen. I mean, if it did happen, like, it wouldn't happen that way. Or there's like too many coincidences or something. It's just too much of a stretch. Whereas I think Kafka walks the line, but it's never quite too much of a stretch. Anyway, I'll say more about this in my next video. And then the other thing is I'm going to drop a video in here at the end about alienation that I always used to show in class when I taught Kafka's Metamorphosis, and that'll be the end of my video here. So thanks for listening, and thanks for your patience waiting for this episode. It's been a long week of entertaining family and kids and birthday stuff, so I kind of fell off my regular schedule, but I hope to get back to it. And like I said, if I can remember it, I'll do the Hawthorne episode next. Okay, bye.